Tonight, we're following several developing stories as we come on the air. At least 8 people are dead, including a mother and child, after historic flooding in Kentucky. Plus, the high-level talks that could reshape Europe and the Middle East. We do begin with that deadly flooding. Kentucky's governor is calling it one of the most serious weather events in a decade. Many of the deaths are attributed to people being trapped in flooded cars. Officials say they've made more than 1,000 water rescues. Up to a half-foot of rain has washed out roads and sent cars into ditches. There is widespread damage across the South. A tree crashed through a roof in Georgia. Hundreds of flights have been canceled, thousands more delayed. Our weather team is following it all, including high winds in the east and a bitter cold blast in the week ahead. President Trump takes in the Daytona 500 while overseas crucial talks begin. Israel's prime minister praises what he calls a bold vision to rebuild Gaza and resettle its population. Secretary of State Marco Rubio calls for Hamas to be eradicated. Negotiations on Ukraine's future are expected soon. Russia's invited, and Ukraine's president is also demanding a seat at the table. Also tonight, a deadly attack in Austria is now being called an act of terror. 6 people were stabbed, a teenager killed. Police say the suspect from Syria was inspired by ISIS. The Justice Department fires more than a dozen immigration judges as the Trump administration moves to shrink the federal government. The firings come despite a growing backlog of millions of pending immigration cases. 5 arrests are made in a shocking and brutal murder. The victim was a transgender man who police say was tortured for months. Authorities are calling it a horrific crime. Flu activity is now at record levels in the U.S. with nearly 30 million cases this season, why experts say there's still time to get vaccinated. Plus, the bitter rivalry on the ice, 3 fights in 9 seconds as the U.S. battles Canada. On the road to the Oscars, who took top honors at the BAFTA Awards, and the emotional home run, why the coach called it one of the most inspiring things he's ever seen.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this Sunday. We begin tonight with a massive storm system sweeping across much of the east. At least 9 people killed. More than 100 million Americans are under alerts for cold and snow. 8 people were killed after historic flooding in Kentucky, including a mother and her 7-year-old child. The governor is calling it one of the most serious weather events in a decade. This drone video captured the devastation. Entire communities submerged underwater. President Trump has already approved an emergency disaster declaration. Severe storms ripped through central Alabama, leaving a trail of destruction, at least 1 confirmed tornado. And much of the Northeast, including Worcester, Massachusetts, is getting a wintry mix of snow, ice, and rain. Hundreds of thousands are without power as frigid temperatures move in. Our weather team is standing by with the forecast. But first, Faith Abube leads us off from Atlanta.
Tonight, a fatal blast of severe weather pummeling the eastern U.S. as dangerous flooding, powerful winds, and wintry conditions wreak havoc from the Gulf Coast to New England. At least 8 people killed in Kentucky, including a child, after more than 6 inches of rain battered parts of the state, prompting more than 1,000 water rescues. Over the weekend, nearly the entire state under flood warnings.
Look at the number of people we've already lost and the damage. This is one of the most serious weather events we've dealt with in at least a decade.
Oh, this is never going to get big.
This road in Pikeville, Kentucky, badly damaged. Nearby, an SUV washed off the road into a ditch. That torrential rain turning to heavy snow in parts of the state. Officials urging residents to avoid the hazardous conditions.
Right now, we need everybody home and not on the roads. As we're in our search and rescue phase, we need our vehicles out on the road, and it's dangerous for you to be out on the road.
How big was the tree?
It was about 100 foot. It was a tall tree.
Meanwhile, in Florence, Mississippi, Jimmy Armour showing us the damage inside his grandparents' home after high winds crashed a large pine tree through the roof.
We were all sitting here in the living room. The rain started, and then it almost sounded like a freight train coming through.
Tonight, the system now sweeping east, flooding, threatening these buildings in Hurley, Virginia. Crews and residents outside of Boston digging out up to 6 inches of snow accumulating in parts of the state. And Lindsay, parts of Kentucky bracing for a second gut punch. Another foot of snow possible by Thursday on top of the flooding emergency. Meantime, here in Georgia, tens of thousands still in the dark. A man killed here overnight after powerful winds toppled a tree onto the house behind me. Lindsay.
All right, Faith, thank you. That severe weather is also causing headaches for those flying over the President's Day holiday weekend. Let's bring in ABC's Perry Russum reporting from Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. tonight. Perry, how much of a disruption are these storms causing for air travel?
Yeah, Lindsay, strong winds are causing some issues here at DCA. About 150 flights have been delayed and dozens more have been canceled across the country. According to FlightAware, more than 1,300 flights have been canceled and more than 8,000 have been delayed. Major hubs in Chicago and Atlanta hit with the most delays. And tonight we're looking at major cities in the Northeast as the storms pass through. Boston and New York affected. Nearly half the flights out of New York's LaGuardia Airport have been delayed. It's a busy time in the skies with President's Day weekend. We have to see how long this weather lasts and what it looks like tomorrow as people return home. Lindsay.
All right, got to pack those patience there, Perry. Thank you. Let's get right to ABC meteorologist Samara Theodore. Samara, when can we expect the next round of winter weather?
Well, Lindsay, the cold air moving in at the top of the week and the next snowstorm moving through Wednesday and Thursday across the country. Let's go ahead and take a look. The storm we have been dealing with is now beginning to exit. In its wake, leaving behind extremely strong winds, high wind alerts stretching from Boston down to the mid-Atlantic with gusts up to 60 miles per hour possible. We also have extreme cold alerts from Bismarck all the way down to Dallas and San Angelo, Texas. This bitter cold diving deep, 35 degrees below zero in Bismarck Monday morning, single digits in Oklahoma City. And as far as the snow goes, we're going to start to see that snow track across places like Kentucky on Wednesday, arriving in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast by Thursday, just in time for that critical Thursday morning commute. Lindsay?
Such an onslaught of the winter weather these days. Samara, thank you. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is overseas on a mission that could change Europe and the Middle East. In a meeting between Rubio and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Netanyahu praised what he calls President Trump's bold vision for Gaza. Both agree that Hamas must be eliminated. Here's ABC senior White House correspondent Selena Wang.
Tonight, President Trump visiting the racetrack, greeting NASCAR fans at the Daytona 500 in Florida. As senior members of his administration are overseas, pushing an agenda that aims to redraw the map in the Middle East. Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, seemingly on the same page about what's next for war-torn Gaza.
Secretary Rubio and I discussed President Trump's bold vision for Gaza.
Trump insisting the U.S. take over Gaza, force out Palestinians, and develop the remaining real estate, promising to build the Riviera of the Middle East. The plan sparking outrage both at home and around the world. Rubio defending the president's position.
It may have shocked and surprised many, but what cannot continue is the same cycle.
While also calling for the complete destruction of Hamas.
Hamas cannot continue as a military or government force. They must be eliminated. That must be eradicated.
Those comments potentially complicating an already delicate situation as Israel and Hamas face mounting pressure to move to phase 2 of their ceasefire deal, which would bring all of the remaining hostages home. And tonight, the Trump administration turning to another crisis with more senior officials heading to Saudi Arabia to begin negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Members of the Trump team expected to meet with Russian officials there, but Ukrainian President Zelensky says he wasn't invited. Zelensky adamant his country must have a seat at the table.
I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never.
Joining us now is our senior White House correspondent, Selena Wang. Selena, how are our allies in Europe reacting to the Trump administration advancing these negotiations without them?
Well, Lindsay, they're concerned they'll be left out of the peacemaking process, and they fear the Trump administration could reach a deal that fails to deter Russia and secure lasting peace. Lindsay?
All right. Selena Wang from the White House. Now to that deadly terror attack in Austria. A 14-year-old was killed and 5 others injured during a stabbing rampage. Authorities say the suspect, a 23-year-old Syrian national, was inspired by ISIS. Earlier today, the grieving community held a vigil for the victims. More now from ABC's Lama Hassan.
Authorities tonight saying the suspect behind a horrific knife attack on Saturday afternoon in the southern Austrian city of Villach near the main square was inspired by ISIS. Officials say a 23-year-old Syrian man using a folding knife began stabbing people indiscriminately, killing a 14-year-old boy and wounding 5 others. 3 of them are in intensive care. Many praising a food delivery driver, also Syrian, for stopping the attacker by ramming his car into him, allowing police to make an arrest. The Interior Minister saying the suspect has links to ISIS and radicalized himself online and is now charged with murder and multiple attempted murders. This incident is the second suspected ISIS-inspired attack in Austria in recent years. According to authorities, in 2020, a man carried out a deadly attack in Vienna, armed with an automatic rifle and fake explosives. Tonight in Austria, many gathering at a makeshift memorial in the main square. A memorial is growing in Munich, too, days after a car was driven into a crowd, injuring dozens and killing a mother and her 2-year-old daughter. German officials investigating whether the driver had ties to any extremist networks.
Lindsay, this latest attack in Austria is triggering a strong response from the country's far-right party. They're now calling for a rigorous crackdown on asylum. Lindsay?
Lama, thank you. Back here in the U.S., over the weekend, more than a dozen immigration judges were fired. It's part of a sweeping attempt to reduce the size of the federal government, but it comes amid an immigration crackdown and a backlog of nearly 4 million cases. More now from ABC's Morgan Norwood.
Tonight, as President Trump and Elon Musk reshape the federal government with mass layoffs triggering anger and confusion among federal employees, ABC News learning the DOJ quietly fired more than a dozen new immigration judges without cause, just days before they were set to be sworn in, according to the union representing them. The sweeping shakeup dismissed 13 immigration judges in training, 2 judges already on the bench, and 5 other mid-level managers that also hear immigration cases. Their union saying in a statement, the firing of immigration judges when we need more judges to enforce our immigration laws by this administration is a perfect example of hypocrisy. The move comes amid a massive backlog of 3.7 million cases and in the middle of an immigration crackdown coast to coast. For 7 days, ABC News was on the front lines, from community groups patrolling the streets for signs of ICE in LA, to D.C., where immigration lawyers are working around the clock, and San Diego, where the Coast Guard is ramping up helicopter patrols. ICE says it arrested more than 8,200 people between January 22nd and January 31st, but ICE has stopped releasing updated numbers, and a fraction of those detained were released back into the U.S. because of a lack of resources. Just days ago, Trump's border czar expressing frustration with the number of ICE arrests.
We got to increase the targeting production. So we're doing that now. We're increasing the targeting.
Homan meeting with New York City Mayor Eric Adams and says he's agreed to work with the Trump administration while they increase teams conducting operations in the city.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?
And Lindsay, back to those fired judges, there's growing concern tonight that this move will only deepen the delays within the immigration system. Now, for perspective, each of those judges processing anywhere between 500 to 700 cases per year. Lindsay?
Morgan, thank you. Now to the brutal and tragic death of a transgender man in upstate New York. Police say that 24-year-old Sam Nordquist was tortured for weeks before his remains were ultimately discovered in a field. Nordquist had been reported missing by his family. 5 people are now charged with his murder. Here's ABC's Ike Ajachi.
Tonight, 5 people have been arrested and charged in connection with the disappearance and brutal murder of a 24-year-old transgender man from Minnesota, a crime police are calling beyond depraved.
This is one of the most horrific crimes I have ever investigated.
Police say Sam Nordquist arrived in the Finger Lakes region of New York State in September, staying at a motel with 38-year-old Precious Arzuaga and others. On February 9th, New York State Police launching a missing persons investigation for Nordquist following a welfare check request from family. On February 13th, police executing a search warrant at Arzuaga's motel room, later finding human remains believed to be those of Nordquist 15 miles away in a field in Yates County. Investigators finding evidence suggesting Nordquist was tortured and sexually assaulted for months.
Sam was subjected to repeated acts of violence and torture in a manner that ultimately led to his death.
Police arresting and charging Arzuaga, as well as 30-year-old Jennifer Quijano, 33-year-old Kyle Sage, 30-year-old Patrick Goodwin, and 19-year-old Emily Mataika with second-degree murder. Tonight, Sam's family heartbroken.
I don't understand why someone would do that to another person. Sam was amazing and would give the shirt off his back to anyone.
Lindsay, investigators are still working to understand the relationship between the 5 suspects in Nordquist. And prosecutors, they've yet to rule out classifying the murder as a hate crime. Lindsay?
All right, Ike, thank you. Now to the record-setting flu season. The CDC is reporting nearly 30 million cases and more than 370,000 hospitalizations. 32 states are reporting high or very high activity. Let's bring in ABC's Rena Roy. So, Rena, what are you learning tonight?
Well, Lindsay, respiratory illnesses are at a high level really across the country. In fact, the rate of people going to the doctor for flu-like symptoms is the highest since the swine flu outbreak in 2009. The CDC estimating 16,000 deaths from the flu so far this season. Nearly 70 of those in children. Fatal flu cases surpassing COVID deaths this week for the first time since the pandemic started. Walgreens saying they've seen a more than 200% jump in flu antiviral medication prescriptions compared to the same time last year. And flu season will likely continue for weeks or even months. Public health specialists reminding people it is not too late to get the annual vaccine, which has been shown to reduce severity and duration of an illness. Lindsay?
So many under the weather lately. Rena, thank you.